Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the surprisingly mundane ways that medieval kings, supposedly chosen by God and protected by divine right, managed to die from things like choking on food, falling off toilets, and getting killed by their own furniture. From Henry I eating too many lampreys to John of Bohemia charging into battle completely blind, this is the story of when absolute power meets absolute bad luck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but that would undermine the whole chosen by God narrative. Unfortunately, the universe has a sense of humor, and some of history's most powerful rulers managed to exit this world in ways that would make a sitcom writer proud. Let's start with King Henry I of England, who in 1135 achieved the impressive feat of dying from overeating. Not just any overeating, mind you, but specifically from consuming too many lampreys, which are basically eel-like fish that look like something from a nightmare and apparently taste good enough to kill for. Henry had been warned by his physicians to avoid lampreys because they disagreed with his aging digestive system, but apparently royal stubbornness extends to ignoring medical advice. The story goes that Henry was visiting Normandy and became absolutely determined to eat a large meal of lampreys despite his doctor's protests. Whether this was royal defiance or just really impressive food cravings, Henry consumed enough lampreys to cause severe digestive distress that led to his death within a week. So the king who successfully conquered Normandy and ruled England for 35 years was ultimately defeated by fish that looked like aquatic snakes. The aftermath was equally ridiculous because Henry's death from lamprey overdose triggered a succession crisis known as the Anarchy, a 19-year civil war between his daughter Matilda and his nephew Stephen. Imagine explaining to future historians that decades of medieval warfare and thousands of deaths were ultimately caused by one king's inability to exercise portion control with prehistoric-looking fish. Then there's King John of Bohemia, who in 1346 managed to get himself killed at the Battle of Crécy through what can only be described as the most enthusiastic display of poor judgment in military history. John was completely blind by this point in his life, which you might think would disqualify him from battlefield leadership. But apparently, medieval concepts of reasonable accommodation didn't extend to keeping blind kings away from active combat zones. John insisted on participating in the battle despite his total lack of vision, so his mites tied their horses' reins together with his, essentially creating a medieval cavalry train with a blind conductor. The plan was for John's knights to guide his horse safely through the battle while allowing him to maintain royal dignity and participate in the fighting. This worked about as well as you'd expect when charging directly into English longbowmen who had no particular interest in accommodating visually impaired royalty. The entire group rode straight into the English lines and were immediately shot full of arrows, creating what was essentially a medieval version of a very expensive group suicide. John of Bohemia died doing what he loved, namely charging into impossible military situations without being able to see where he was going. His death became legendary for its brave futility, and the Prince of Wales adopted John's motto, Ich dien, I serve, along with his feathered crest, which is still used today. King Edmund Ironside of England died in 1016 in a way that medieval chroniclers found so embarrassing they could barely bring themselves to record it accurately. According to the most commonly accepted account, Edmund was assassinated while using the royal latrine, which is essentially the medieval equivalent of being murdered while on the toilet. The assassin allegedly hid in the privy pit and stabbed upward with a sharp instrument when Edmund sat down to attend to his business. This method of assassination required impressive patience from the killer, who would have had to hide in what was essentially a medieval septic tank while waiting for the king to arrive for his bathroom break. It also demonstrates remarkable dedication to regicide, since there were probably more pleasant ways to commit political murder that didn't involve spending hours hiding in royal waste. The political implications were almost as messy as the assassination method, since Edmund's death allowed Canute the Great to become undisputed king of England. Medieval succession politics were complicated enough without adding bathroom-based assassination plots, but apparently 11th century political operators were willing to get creative with their regime change strategies. King Alexander III of Scotland achieved a perfectly avoidable death in 1286 by insisting on traveling during bad weather to visit his young wife. Alexander was 44 years old and had recently remarried a much younger woman, which apparently motivated him to make romantic gestures that ignored basic safety precautions like checking weather conditions before long-distance travel. On a stormy March night, Alexander decided to ride from Edinburgh to Fife to surprise his wife, despite warnings from his advisors that the weather was too dangerous for travel. Medieval roads were challenging enough under good conditions, consisting mostly of muddy tracks that became treacherous during storms, but Alexander was apparently too eager for a romantic reunion to wait for better weather. The journey went exactly as his advisors had predicted. Alexander's horse lost its footing on the treacherous path and threw the king over a cliff where he died instantly from the fall. His body was found the next morning, and Scotland was plunged into a succession crisis because Alexander had no clear heir, leading to decades of conflict with England. So one king's inability to delay gratification for better weather conditions ultimately led to the wars of Scottish independence and centuries of conflict between Scotland and England. Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, and the entire Scottish struggle for independence can be traced back to Alexander III's fatal decision to prioritize romance over meteorological common sense. King Charles VIII of France managed to kill himself in 1498 through what might be the most mundane royal death in medieval history. He hit his head on a door frame. Charles was a relatively short man, even by medieval standards, but the doorframe in question was apparently even shorter, located in a corridor at the Château d'Amboise that had been built for people of more modest stature than royalty. The accident happened while Charles was hurrying to watch a tennis match, because apparently medieval kings had the same enthusiasm for sports entertainment that leads modern people to rush for good seats at sporting events. Charles was moving quickly through the low corridor when he struck his head violently against the stone lintel, immediately losing consciousness and dying within hours from what was probably a severe brain hemorrhage. The political consequences were immediate and far-reaching because Charles had no male heirs, meaning the crown passed to his cousin Louis XII. This succession change affected French foreign policy, marriage alliances, and territorial disputes for decades afterward. The Italian Wars, various territorial conflicts, and multiple diplomatic crises can all be traced back to one king's failure to duck while hurrying to a tennis match. King William II of England, known as William Rufus, died in 1100 during a hunting expedition in what was officially ruled an accident, but which many historians suspect was assassination disguised as accidental death. William was hunting in the New Forest with a group of nobles when he was struck in the chest by an arrow allegedly shot by Walter Tyrrell, who claimed the shot was aimed at a deer but missed and killed the king instead. The suspicious circumstances included the fact that William was deeply unpopular with both nobles and clergy. Walter Tyrrell immediately fled to France without staying to explain the accident, and William's brother, Henry, conveniently happened to be nearby and immediately seized the royal treasury in Winchester. Either this was the most fortunate hunting accident in medieval history, or the most poorly disguised assassination plot. Regardless of whether William's death was accidental or intentional, the immediate aftermath demonstrated medieval priorities perfectly. Instead of providing medical care or conducting a proper investigation, Henry I abandoned his brother's body in the forest and rushed to secure his claim to the throne. William's corpse was eventually loaded onto a cart by local charcoal burners and delivered to Winchester Cathedral, where he was buried with minimal ceremony and maximum political convenience. King Louis VI of France, known as Louis the Fat, lived up to his nickname by dying in 1137 from complications related to severe obesity and dysentery, a combination that medieval medicine was completely unprepared to handle. Louis had spent years consuming royal feasts with the kind of enthusiasm that made his obesity legendary, even by medieval standards, when most people struggled to get enough calories to survive. The final illness began with dysentery, which was common enough in medieval times, but became particularly dangerous for someone of Louis's size and general health condition. Medieval treatments for dysentery included bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies that probably made the condition worse while providing no actual medical benefit. Louis's royal physicians applied these treatments enthusiastically, likely accelerating his death through well-intentioned incompetence. Louis's death from overeating complications was particularly ironic because he had been a successful military leader and effective king who expanded French royal authority significantly during his reign. However, his inability to moderate his food consumption ultimately proved more dangerous than any enemy army or political conspiracy he had faced during decades of medieval warfare. King Philip of France died in 1885 after falling from his horse when the animal was startled by a black pig that ran across their path during a ride through Paris. This might be the only recorded case in history of regicide by livestock, demonstrating that even the most mundane animals could pose mortal threats to medieval royalty under the right circumstances. The accident happened in broad daylight on a busy Parisian street, so there were plenty of witnesses to confirm that the King of France was indeed killed by a pig-related horse accident. Philip was thrown from his mount when the horse reared in surprise at the pig's sudden appearance, and the king struck his head on the stone pavement with fatal force. Medieval urban planning apparently didn't include effective livestock control, since pigs regularly wandered through city streets foraging for food scraps and generally creating the kind of traffic hazards that could kill royalty. Philip's death led to the succession of his son Philip IV, who became one of France's most powerful medieval kings, suggesting that sometimes random pig encounters can actually improve political outcomes. King Bela I of Hungary managed to die in 1063 in a way that combined political assassination with furniture-related accidents. Bela was murdered when his throne collapsed during a court ceremony, but the collapse wasn't accidental. Conspirators had deliberately weakened the throne's supports so that it would fall apart when the king sat down, presumably crushing or injuring him enough to allow the assassins to finish the job. This assassination method required considerable advance planning and technical expertise, since medieval thrones were substantial pieces of furniture designed to support royal weight while projecting appropriate majesty and authority. The conspirators had to calculate exactly how to weaken the throne structure so that it would collapse at the right moment without being obviously damaged beforehand. The political aftermath involved the usual medieval succession crisis, but with the added complication that future Hungarian kings probably developed trust issues regarding their furniture. Court ceremonies became potentially dangerous events, requiring careful inspection of seating arrangements, creating a new category of royal security concerns that extended to home furnishings. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire died in 1190 during the Third Crusade in a way that was both heroic and ridiculous simultaneously. Frederick was leading his army through Anatolia when he decided to cool off by taking a swim in the Salef River, despite being nearly 70 years old and wearing heavy armor that made swimming inadvisable under any circumstances. Various accounts of Frederick's death disagree on the exact details, but most agree that he either drowned while swimming or suffered a heart attack brought on by the shock of cold water, heavy armor, and advanced age combining into a perfect storm of poor decision-making. Some sources suggest he was trying to ford the river on horseback and fell in, while others claim he deliberately entered the water for bathing or cooling purposes. Regardless of the specific circumstances, Frederick's death from swimming-related causes effectively ended German participation in the Third Crusade and significantly altered the political balance of medieval Europe. The Holy Roman Empire lost its most charismatic leader, while the crusading movement lost one of its most committed royal supporters, all because one emperor couldn't resist taking a dip in a Turkish river. King James II of Scotland died in 1460 during the siege of Roxburgh Castle when one of his own cannons exploded, demonstrating that medieval military technology was about as dangerous to its operators as to enemy targets. James was enthusiastic about artillery, which was still relatively new technology in the 14th century and hadn't yet reached reliable safety standards. The fatal cannon was reportedly a wedding gift from the Duke of Burgundy, making this perhaps the only recorded case of death by exploding wedding present in medieval history. James was standing too close to the cannon when it fired, either because he wanted to observe its effectiveness or because medieval artillery safety protocols hadn't been invented yet. The cannon burst during firing, sending metal fragments in all directions and fatally wounding the king. The political consequences included another Scottish succession crisis, since James's heir was only 8 years old, leading to decades of regency government and political instability. Medieval Scotland's relationship with England was further complicated by having a child king, while the development of Scottish artillery was probably set back by the association between cannons and regicide. King Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad, died in 1387 in what might be the most bizarre medical accident in medieval history. Charles was suffering from an illness that caused his physicians to recommend wrapping him in linen cloth soaked with brandy as a form of treatment. This medieval medical procedure went horribly wrong when a servant accidentally brought a candle too close to the brandy-soaked bandages, immediately setting the king on fire. Medieval medicine's combination of flammable alcohol and open flames proved to be exactly as dangerous as modern people would expect, but apparently 14th century physicians hadn't considered the fire safety implications of their treatment methods. Charles was severely burned and died shortly afterward from his injuries, making him possibly the only king in history to be accidentally murdered by his own medical treatment team. The irony of Charles the Bad dying from medical malpractice was not lost on contemporary chroniclers, who noted that a king who had spent his career plotting assassinations and political murders ultimately died from an accident caused by his own doctor's therapeutic incompetence. Medieval justice had a sense of poetic humor that even extended to royal healthcare disasters. King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia nearly died in 1400 from a heart attack brought on by excessive anger during a political argument, demonstrating that medieval stress management was about as effective as medieval medicine. Wenceslaus was known for his violent temper and tendency to become enraged during court proceedings, which regularly created health risks that his physicians were completely unprepared to address. The near-fatal incident occurred during a meeting with nobles who were presenting grievances about royal policies. Wenceslaus became so angry during the discussion that he suffered what was probably a serious heart attack or stroke, collapsing unconscious and remaining near death for several days. While he eventually recovered from this particular episode, his health was permanently damaged by the incident. Wenceslaus's anger-related health problems illustrate the medieval approach to conflict resolution, which often involved shouting matches that could literally be fatal for participants with cardiovascular issues. Medieval political negotiations were apparently conducted under stress levels that would alarm modern emergency room physicians, creating occupational hazards that extended beyond obvious dangers like warfare and assassination attempts. The pattern that emerges from these royal deaths is that medieval kings were surprisingly vulnerable to ordinary accidents and poor decision-making, despite having access to the best available medical care, food tasting services, and personal protection that their era could provide. Divine right of kings apparently didn't extend to protection from overeating, furniture failures, or basic physics involving horses and stone pavement. These deaths also demonstrate that medieval political systems were remarkably fragile, since the death of one king could trigger succession crises, civil wars, and international conflicts that lasted for decades. The death of one king from lamprey overconsumption led to 19 years of English Civil War, while a pig-related horse accident changed the entire trajectory of French medieval politics. Medieval medicine's inability to handle basic health problems meant that even minor accidents or illnesses could become fatal for royalty, despite access to the most educated physicians available. Royal doctors armed with bloodletting equipment and herbal remedies were essentially helpless against conditions that modern medicine could easily treat, creating a healthcare lottery that even divine kingship couldn't overcome. The contrast between royal power and royal mortality created an ongoing tension in medieval political systems, since kings who could command armies and control kingdoms remained vulnerable to random accidents that could eliminate them instantly. This vulnerability required constant vigilance and careful behavior that many medieval rulers found difficult to maintain consistently. As we settle into sleep thinking about these medieval royal disasters, there's something oddly comforting in knowing that even absolute monarchs with divine authority couldn't escape the basic human tendency to make poor choices involving food, transportation, and furniture safety. Power might corrupt, but it doesn't prevent people from choking on fish or getting killed by exploding wedding presents. Tomorrow's modern world, with its food safety regulations, building codes, and basic understanding of physics, suddenly seems remarkably safe compared to medieval royal courts where dinner could be fatal and throne rooms contained furniture designed for assassination purposes. Sometimes the past makes the present look pretty good, even during ordinary Tuesday afternoons that don't involve any pig-related horse accidents or exploding artillery gifts. And in the peaceful darkness of our much safer modern world, where kings are mostly ceremonial and furniture is generally trustworthy, sleep comes with the quiet satisfaction of living in an era where royal deaths from stupidity are mostly historical curiosities rather than ongoing political crises. Welcome to our most entertainingly ridiculous journey yet through the archives of human military incompetence. Tonight, we're trading pharaohs and pyramids for knights and catastrophically bad decisions as we explore the medieval battles that make you wonder how humanity ever survived its own strategic brilliance. From armies that literally fought themselves in the dark to wars that started over pastries, this is the story of medieval military minds that proved conclusively that having armor and weapons doesn't automatically make you good at using them. We're about to spend the next 40 minutes discovering that medieval warfare was often less art of war and more art of spectacular failure. You are Brother Thomas, a Benedictine monk and chronicler working in the monastery of Saint Denis, tasked with recording the military campaigns of the late medieval period for posterity. Welcome to your desk in the scriptorium, circa 1470 CE, where your job is to document the battles and campaigns of your era with scholarly objectivity, even when the events you're recording seem too stupid to be believed by future generations who might read your chronicles. The afternoon light filters through the monastery's colored glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the parchment pages where you're struggling to find diplomatic language for describing military disasters that would be hilarious if they hadn't gotten so many people killed. The ink on your quill has gone cold 3 times already as you pause, wondering how to explain to future readers that grown men with years of military training could make such spectacularly poor decisions in life-or-death situations. The scale of medieval military incompetence you're documenting goes far beyond simple tactical errors. These aren't cases of noble defeat against overwhelming odds or honorable losses to superior strategy. These are battles lost through sheer breathtaking stupidity, where victory was handed to armies that were often just as confused and incompetent as their opponents, but happened to make slightly fewer catastrophically bad decisions. But here's the thing that makes your chronicling work so challenging. You have to maintain the respectful tone appropriate for recording the deeds of nobles and knights while documenting military campaigns that read like comedy performances written by someone who fundamentally misunderstood how warfare is supposed to work. Your first entry concerns the Battle of Caran-Sebez in 1788, Though technically post-medieval, it represents the pinnacle of military self-destruction that had been building for centuries. The Austrian army, some 100,000 strong, managed to fight a pitched battle against itself in complete darkness, resulting in thousands of casualties and a retreat from an enemy that turned out to be their own advanced scouts returning from a reconnaissance mission. The battle began when Austrian hussars, returning from patrol, encountered their own infantry in the dark and attempted to give the password in German to soldiers who only spoke Croatian. The language confusion led to shouting, then to someone firing a musket, then to the gradual escalation of an entire army shooting at itself for several hours before anyone realized that the Turkish attack they were repelling was actually their own troops. Your quill scratches across the parchment as you try to find scholarly language for describing how an entire army could mistake itself for the enemy and maintain that mistake long enough to inflict serious casualties. The logistics of the confusion are almost as impressive as the stupidity. Different units spoke different languages, used different passwords, and had no reliable way to identify friend from foe in the darkness of a Balkan night. The aftermath of Karahan Sebez reveals the cascading effects of military incompetence. Officers who survived the friendly fire had to explain to their superiors how they had managed to defeat their own army more thoroughly than the Turks had in years of actual warfare. The official reports, you note wryly, blamed communication difficulties and challenging nighttime conditions. Moving backward through your chronological survey, you document the War of Jenkins' Ear, a conflict that lasted 9 years and cost thousands of lives over a single severed ear that may or may not have actually belonged to the English sea captain Robert Jenkins. The Spanish authorities allegedly cut off Jenkins' ear in 1331, but by the time the story reached Parliament 7 years later, it had grown into a cause for full-scale war between Britain and Spain. The absurdity of the Jenkins' ear conflict lies not just in its trivial origins, but in how it escalated through a series of increasingly ridiculous diplomatic failures. Politicians who had never seen Jenkins' alleged ear became passionate advocates for British maritime honor, while Spanish officials who had nothing to do with the original incident found themselves defending imperial policy based on the supposed ear-severing practices of colonial customs officers. The actual military campaigns of the War of Jenkins' Ear demonstrated the same level of strategic thinking that characterized its origins. British expeditions to the Caribbean were planned by men who had never been to the Caribbean, using maps that were decades out of date and supply strategies that assumed tropical diseases would respect British naval traditions. Your chronicles record how Admiral Edward Vernon, the hero of the Jenkins' Ear campaigns, managed to capture the same Spanish fort 3 times because his subordinates kept abandoning it for reasons that made sense only to them at the time. The Spanish, for their part, kept recapturing a fort they didn't particularly want because they assumed the British wouldn't keep taking it unless it was strategically vital. The Battle of the Golden Spurs provides another spectacular example of medieval military thinking at its finest. French knights, the flower of European cavalry, charged into the muddy fields of Courtrai in 1302 with such enthusiasm that they became physically stuck in the ground like armored fence posts, creating easy targets for Flemish infantry who had been expecting to lose the battle until their opponents kindly immobilized themselves in the bog. The tactical analysis of the Golden Spurs battle reveals layers of bad decision-making that required genuine commitment to stupidity. The French commanders could see the muddy terrain, had been warned about the ground conditions by local scouts, and chose to charge anyway because dismounting and fighting on foot was considered beneath the dignity of properly trained knights. The aftermath of the Golden Spurs created a field littered with golden spurs, taken from the French knight's boots, giving the battle its name, and providing the Flemish with enough valuable metal to fund their army for the next several campaigns. The French loss was so complete that surviving knights had to walk home barefoot, having lost not just the battle, but their dignity and their footwear to opponents they had expected to crush. Your documentation moves to the siege of Weinsberg in 1140, where military stupidity took the form of misguided chivalry rather than tactical incompetence. The German king Conrad III offered to spare the lives of the women in the besieged town and allow them to leave with whatever they could carry on their backs. The women promptly carried out all the men, including their husbands and sons, leaving the king with the choice of honoring his word or admitting he'd been outwitted by a group of civilians he had assumed would grab jewelry and clothing. The Weinsberg incident demonstrates how medieval military leaders could be undone not by enemy strategy, but by their own failure to think through the implications of their seemingly generous offers. Conrad's attempt at magnanimous victory became a humiliating defeat when he discovered that his enemies were better at interpreting his words than he was at choosing them. The chronicle of the Pastry War requires particularly delicate handling because it involves a conflict between France and Mexico over unpaid debts to a pastry chef whose shop had been damaged during Mexican civil unrest. The French government's decision to blockade Mexican ports and invade Veracruz over 60,000 francs in pastry-related damages created a diplomatic crisis that cost far more than the original debt could ever have justified. The military campaigns of the Pastry War showcased the same level of strategic thinking that characterized its origins. French naval forces spent months blockading Mexican ports to force payment of a debt that could have been settled for less than the cost of maintaining the blockade for a single week. Mexican forces, for their part, fought battles that cost more in ammunition than the disputed pastries had ever been worth. Your records of the Battle of Sandwich in 1217 reveal another classic example of medieval tactical brilliance. The French fleet, supporting Prince Louis's invasion of England, was defeated by English ships that attacked with the wind behind them and threw quicklime powder into the air to blind the French sailors. The French commanders, seeing the white cloud approaching their ships, assumed it was some kind of English weather magic and began praying instead of taking the basic precaution of covering their faces. The quicklime strategy worked so well that the English captured the entire French fleet without losing a single ship. Though the victory was due less to English tactical genius than to French inability to recognize an occupational hazard that any mason or builder could have identified and countered with a wet cloth. The Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333 provides a perfect example of how medieval military leaders could learn exactly the wrong lessons from previous defeats. Scottish commanders, having seen English longbows devastate cavalry charges, decided the solution was to attack English positions uphill on foot, creating even easier targets for the archers they were trying to avoid. The Scottish tactical plan for Halidon Hill involved advancing across marshy ground, up a steep slope, against entrenched English positions defended by experienced archers who had all day to adjust their aim. The plan succeeded brilliantly in demonstrating that bad tactics could be made worse with sufficient determination. Your chronicles document the siege of Orléans' lesser-known predecessor, the Siege of Meaux in 1421 to 1422, where English forces spent 7 months besieging a town that had already surrendered twice, but kept being recaptured by French relief forces who arrived just after the English had given up and left. The cycle repeated so many times that soldiers on both sides began to consider the siege a seasonal employment opportunity rather than a military operation. The Siege of Meaux became a case study in how not to conduct siege warfare. The English built extensive siege works, then abandoned them when the town surrendered. French forces would reoccupy the town and begin repairing the defenses. The English would return, find the town refortified, and begin the siege again using the same tactics that had failed in previous attempts. The Battle of Bremule in 1119 demonstrates how medieval warfare could be undone by the weight of its own armor. French knights, attempting to retreat from a losing battle, discovered that their horses couldn't run effectively while carrying fully armored riders across muddy ground, turning an orderly withdrawal into a slow-motion disaster where English infantry could simply walk alongside the struggling horses and pull riders from their saddles like fruit from heavily laden trees.
The tactical lessons from Bremule were clear. Heavy cavalry needed appropriate terrain and weather conditions to be effective. Unfortunately, these lessons were immediately forgotten by the next generation of commanders who assumed that more armor and bigger horses would solve the mobility problems that had doomed their predecessors. Your documentation of the Battle of Crécy includes the often overlooked detail that French crossbowmen were defeated partly because their bowstrings had gotten wet in the rain and they had forgotten to bring backup strings, while English longbowmen kept their strings dry under their hats and in waterproof cases. The English technological superiority came down to basic equipment maintenance rather than revolutionary military innovation. The aftermath of Crécy reveals how military disasters could be transformed into propaganda victories through creative reporting. French chroniclers described the battle as a heroic defeat against overwhelming odds, while English accounts emphasized the tactical brilliance of their commanders rather than admitting that victory came from having dry bowstrings on a rainy day. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356 showcases another spectacular example of French military learning. Having been defeated at Crécy by English longbows, French commanders developed a sophisticated tactical response. They would attack the English in exactly the same way as before, but with more enthusiasm and better armor that would surely solve the arrow problem. The French tactical innovations at Poitiers included dismounting their knights to avoid the horse-targeting tactics that had failed at Crécy, then advancing on foot across difficult terrain toward entrenched English positions, creating even easier targets for archers who now had stationary rather than moving targets. Your chronicle of the Battle of Agincourt focuses on the often ignored fact that French military planning was based on assuming their enemies would be stupid enough to fight fair. French commanders positioned their forces assuming the English would advance across open ground into a conventional medieval battle, rather than taking defensive positions and forcing the French to attack uphill, through mud, against fortified positions defended by experienced archers.
The French tactical plan for Agincourt involved advancing in formation across a plowed field that recent rains had turned into a mud trap, while wearing full armor that weighed more than many modern motorcycles. The plan worked perfectly for creating a target-rich environment for English archers, who couldn't believe their enemies were making the same mistakes that had failed in previous battles. The siege of Constantinople's final phase in 1453 provides an example of how technological superiority could be negated by operational incompetence. The Ottoman cannons that breached the city walls were so large and powerful that they could fire only 7 times per day due to overheating and maintenance requirements, giving defenders ample time to repair damage between bombardments if they had possessed the leadership and organization to coordinate effective repairs. The fall of Constantinople demonstrates how technological warfare couldn't guarantee victory when operators lacked the technical knowledge to use their weapons effectively. Ottoman gunners achieved success partly because their enemies were even less competent at defensive engineering than they were at artillery operations. Your chronicles include the Battle of Nancy in 1477, where Charles the Bold of Burgundy was defeated and killed partly because he insisted on fighting in winter conditions that made effective use of his cavalry impossible. The battle was fought in snow so deep that horses couldn't maneuver and armored knights couldn't maintain their footing, turning what should have been a mobile engagement into a stationary slaughter. The tactical analysis of Nancy reveals how commanders could be defeated by their refusal to adapt tactics to environmental conditions. Charles the Bold's insistence on fighting according to chivalric traditions rather than practical military necessity turned superior numbers and equipment into disadvantages that his enemies exploited. The Battle of Flodden in 1513 demonstrates how technological innovation could backfire when operators didn't understand their new equipment. Scottish forces equipped with pikes, designed for fighting cavalry, found themselves facing English infantry with bells and halberds, specifically designed for close combat against pike formations, turning their advanced weapons into liabilities that hindered rather than helped their combat effectiveness. The Scottish defeat at Flodden was caused partly by King James IV's decision to adopt Swiss pike tactics without understanding that Swiss success came from training and discipline rather than just carrying long spears. Scottish pikemen lacked the coordination and experience necessary to use their weapons effectively against opponents who understood how to counter pike formations. Your documentation of siege warfare includes the Siege of Kenilworth in 1266, which lasted 6 months, partly because both sides kept making tactical errors that prolonged the conflict unnecessarily. The defenders had adequate food and water, but periodically launched sorties that weakened their position, while siegers had sufficient forces to storm the castle, but preferred to wait for starvation that never came due to effective supply management by the defenders. The prolonged nature of medieval sieges often resulted from mutual incompetence rather than strategic brilliance on either side. Commanders who understood siege warfare could usually force relatively quick resolutions, while incompetent leaders on both sides could extend conflicts for months or years through poor decision-making and tactical errors. The Battle of Taunton in 1461 showcases how weather conditions could be ignored by commanders who prioritized symbolic timing over tactical advantage. The battle was fought in a snowstorm that reduced visibility to a few yards, making coordinated tactics impossible and turning the engagement into a series of small, confused fights between groups that couldn't see beyond their immediate vicinity. The casualties at Taunton were exceptionally high, partly because soldiers couldn't see well enough to surrender effectively or retreat in good order. Commanders on both sides lost control of their forces early in the battle and spent the rest of the day trying to locate their own troops in the snow. Your final entries concern the various battles where military leaders were defeated by their own success. The Battle of Courtrais' aftermath saw Flemish infantry so surprised by their victory over French knights that they abandoned the battlefield to loot the dead, allowing French reinforcements to recapture the area and turn tactical victory into strategic defeat through poor follow-up planning. The pattern of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory appears throughout medieval military history, as commanders who succeeded in battle failed to understand what came next. Tactical competence rarely extended to strategic thinking, and victories were often wasted through inability to capitalize on temporary advantages gained through combat success. As your chronicle work draws toward completion, the patterns become unmistakably clear. Medieval military incompetence resulted from the combination of rigid tactical thinking, inadequate intelligence gathering, poor communication systems, and the persistent belief that social rank qualified nobles for military leadership regardless of their actual competence. The lessons from medieval military disasters remain relevant for modern readers, who can recognize similar patterns of institutional thinking, failure to adapt to changing conditions, and the tendency to repeat failed strategies with increased intensity, rather than developing new approaches to persistent problems. Your work as a chronicler provides a unique perspective on how military history is shaped by the people who make strategic decisions under pressure. The difference between victory and defeat often came down to which side made fewer catastrophically stupid mistakes, rather than which side demonstrated superior tactical brilliance. As evening falls over the monastery scriptorium, your quill finally rests after documenting humanity's most spectacular military failures. The ink has dried on chronicles that will preserve these lessons for future generations who may learn from the mistakes of medieval commanders who confused bravery with strategy and tactical tradition with effective military thinking. The completed chronicles represent thousands of lives lost to military incompetence that was entirely preventable with better leadership, planning, and tactical flexibility. These weren't noble defeats or heroic last stands, but needless disasters caused by commanders who valued appearance over effectiveness and tradition over adaptation. Tonight, as the monastery settles into peaceful evening prayers, you can rest knowing that future military leaders might learn from these documented failures and avoid repeating the spectacular mistakes that turned medieval battlefields into monuments to human tactical stupidity and strategic inflexibility. The gentle evening bells call the community to vespers, while your chronicles preserve the memory of battles won and lost through accident, incompetence, and the persistent human ability to complicate simple military problems through overthinking and tradition-bound inflexibility. And in the peaceful medieval night, illuminated by candlelight and filled with chanted prayers, we can rest knowing that some lessons are so important they must be recorded for posterity, even when those lessons reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for institutional incompetence that transcends historical periods and military technologies. The dumbest battles sleep quietly now in the archives, their lessons preserved, but their stupidity contained within the pages of chronicles that transform military disaster into educational opportunity, and spectacular failure into wisdom for future generations, who may prove more capable of learning from others' mistakes. And as both chronicler and reader settle into rest, the night holds the gentle promise that human nature, while capable of remarkable stupidity, is also capable of learning, growth, and the gradual improvement that comes from understanding our own capacity for error and working to do better than our predecessors. In the quiet darkness that embraces both ancient battlefields and medieval scriptoriums, we find peace in knowing that even the most spectacular failures can become valuable lessons when properly documented and understood, transforming military disaster into educational treasure and proving that wisdom often comes from studying what not to do, one carefully chronicled mistake at a time.